Following is my conversation with Aodan Coburn. Aodan is a seasoned media and entertainment industry veteran and a global executive in the true sense of the word. He's running an awesome coaching and management consulting practice based out of Ireland these days. We talk about coming out of COVID. What do organizations need to do in terms of getting ready for the challenges of today? We talk about all different type of work models, how to keep teams motivated, what are the right questions to think about. Then in the context of supply chains and disruptions and black swan events, we talk about best practices and what type of things to think about, how to manage supplier relationships. We talk extensively about China and its role in the modern world in the context of supply chains. We also talk about European Union and Brexit and what does that mean for supply chains. Then we talk about Ireland, which is in no two ways an awesome place for innovation, whether it is corporate innovation or whether it is for startups. And we talk about the ecosystem of Ireland at length and what are all the opportunities that are available. Aodan and his company helps startups and other businesses to get set up in Ireland and how to leverage all the benefits that the ecosystem of Ireland has to offer. Definitely worth checking, and we are going to put the links in the video for your easy reference. And now, here is my conversation with Aodan Coburn. Hope you enjoy. Aodan, sir, how are you?
I'm very good, Amjad. Lovely to see you. Excited to be part of this.
I'm so looking forward to this conversation with you for some time now. Before we get into our conversation, how is the summer in Ireland, sir, going?
Summer in Ireland is generally pretty wet. So the price we pay for such a beautiful country, is that 1 out of every 2 days we get rain. So it's very hard to predict, but you know what? It's still great, and the days are very long, which is brilliant. So lots of daylight. So
it's awesome. That's awesome. I have always been a big fan of yours. Your strategic thinking, how you connect the dots, and I, as of late, have been following your executive coaching, consulting practice, how you bring people together. So coming out of COVID, people and companies, they are facing different kind of challenges. Many models that worked previously got disrupted, supply chains got disrupted, and we are not fully out of the impact of COVID yet. People predict that it may take another 18 months or so. But meanwhile, businesses have to be run and life has to go on. And I thought it would be great for our audience to hear just your thoughts first of, in times like this, how to think about robustness and resilience and just in general, how you think COVID has changed the universe for, better or worse. And, they always say that never let a crisis go to waste. So from a learning perspective, would love to hear your thoughts. I think that would be a good point to start our conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I'm one of the founders of an entity which is branded Global Coaching Delivered, and we've got a couple of key founders, but the premise is that we're delivering seamlessly coaching messages pretty much in any territory in the world. So at any point in time, I think uniquely, we're seeing into business in lots of different parts of the world, and we're seeing the differences, and I think we're seeing the consistencies. And I think that, where I start from, and this is, I often blog about this, is I start from a place of giving the employee the benefit of the doubt, and also giving the employee an element of thanks and gratitude, because the reality of it is that as businesses were challenged, employees stepped up, and I'm not saying there weren't positives for them, but in a lot of instances, they brought the workplace into the home, they dedicated space and time, created new structures for themselves. And I think it's important in business to try and always remember that at your lowest point, who were the people that stepped up and who were the partners that you had in place. And and part of my learning on that, to be frank, was around the Sony hack, a long time back. But actually, if I may, you were one of the partners that stepped up. We had been talking about changing the VMI system in North America for quite a amount of time. And rather than spend time to restand something up, you stepped up and said, look, we'll get this done in 4 weeks, something that should have taken 6 months. And I do think it is important, that in business, we remember those that step up. We remember the emotion and the challenges that we had. So we move ourselves along now, and we find ourselves in models where there are hybrid working models where people are, much more comfortable around digital communication, where people, perhaps are just visiting the office for a certain number of days in the week or in the month. And there seems to be as many solutions as emails as I get in a day. So lots of different businesses. Some businesses are saying, we trust you, you do what you need to do to deliver what you need to deliver for us. Some other businesses are talking about, we want to get back to the status quo. We want to have a reset button. And often their rationale is to say, look, if we have people physically together, we think there's a creativity, there's a camaraderie that we don't think that we can get in the digital space. And I think that the view that we would have as a business is that the solution actually is driven by the business, and it's also driven by, I think, the context in which you're operating. That's the reality of it. I think you've got to be, to be a successful business, you've got to have great people in place, right? And not only that, but they've got to be super engaged and care about your business. So if you move from a position where perhaps people can, work at home and work, have a better work-life balance, and you move to a situation where it's all or nothing, the reality is that you will see people move away. They're branding it now the Great Resignation in North America, where people are coming back into businesses and they're saying, you know what, I'm going to do this, but at the same time, I'm going to look for something else. And I think that the view that we would take and what we would say to people is that from a business perspective, be humble and appreciative of what's been done, over communicate your concerns, right? And I think, look at your mission statements, look at your values as an organization, and live those as you go into a conversation, because there's no point in talking about trust and integrity and teamwork if you don't trust people.
Yeah.
And we think that through an iterative process, that ultimately good businesses will find the right solution. And there's a heck of a premium. I mean, the premium, to keep good people in your organization who understand the systems, they understand where you are and how you got there, right? To have people, not looking for the next job, not, negotiating or, speaking ill of your business, either to your customers or internally. There's a real positive, I think, around, we think around that. So when people talk about hitting the reset, I think, our view would be, we've already reset. The question now is, starting from here,
Yeah.
how do we go forward?
No, that is so insightful. And it looks like, so I'm involved here in North America in tech industry. That's some kind of a hybrid model where around values and the need of the business, but a hybrid model is going to be the new reality. Certainly, to your point, as you said, the reset has already happened. So you, Aodan, talk to a lot of people in the industry as part of your network, as part of your coaching practice. What are questions on executives' minds? What kind of problems they are facing, or what is their consciousness or self-awareness about any problems, any patterns, any consistent themes, questions that you see across industries and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, look, in the coaching world, the issues are fairly consistent. Often we're dealing with, say, startup companies who've got, they've got their B financing. Everybody knows there's a commercial potential here. And the question is, the gentleman who was the smart executive that came up with the idea, can he scale in terms of governance and create something that really drives value? And I think that we're seeing, actually, we're probably seeing more of that in our business, I think, than we have historically. I think there's definitely an element of that. I would say for us, and across the coaching industry, the fastest growing part of the industry is team coaching. So we're dealing with more requests, and because I think that as people come out of the pandemic, they're looking for these opportunities just to reset and almost reintroduce themselves. There are a lot of my background is the studio business, and a lot of the studios, people haven't been on site for 18 months. People have joined and left organizations and no one has ever met them. So there is a resetting that needs to happen in terms of familiarity, and some of that activity is something that we're offering, and that we're putting programs together around that. I think the other big difference that we're seeing, and I think you're seeing this in a lot of businesses, is that as organizations reach out, there's a lot more comfort around online engagement. So, in the old days, coaching by Teams or Zoom or whatever would have almost been seen as secondary, as a less ideal. And I think that really has changed. What we're seeing in our engagement is that there's already an acceptance. There's a comfort around the convenience. And one of the things that we are doing is we're retooling to create the tools to have an engagement online that is not the same as the physical one-to-one, but actually in some ways can be better, particularly if it's around interactivity, if it's around illustration and the like. So we see that there are a whole suite of tools that we can develop as we go forward. And the great thing about it is you can be anywhere in the world at the same time, but also people can go back and look at the documentation and the programs that you created together, and they can revisit them in a way that's very difficult, in a physical world. So what we're seeing and what we're challenged to do, and we're rising to that challenge, is about how to create a better experience online overall, acknowledging that there are certain things that aren't quite the same, but looking at the potential to make it even better. So that I think is a big change for us as well. And then I would just say, look, the majority of key executive, programs that we have in place are really around change. And it's about people who are looking into change, who are challenged by change, perhaps, that next level that the organization has identified them for, perhaps there's a requirement to change their patterns of behavior because, often it's a functional expertise that gets you to a senior management level, but it's a broader skills set. It's executive presence. It's about the ability to sit at the board level and contribute to the overall organization, as opposed to just reflect, your narrow base from which you have come. Those things, those challenges, I think we're seeing more of, if I'm honest, more acknowledgement around the idea and need for change. And then just at a much higher level, Amjad, I would just say it feels like people are more willing now to take the time to think about the soft skills, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of data around people reflecting on their lives and their value of their lives and taking the time to think about where they are. And that's wonderful for us, because that's a space that we also, delve into, because a lot of the executive journeys we go on are about creating awareness. But to create awareness, you've got to go right back and really understand where these patterns came from, how they were reinforced. And then, of course, the trick is, it's not just about awareness. Executive coaching is about performance. It's about improving demonstrably performance and contribution to an organization. So you have to move beyond awareness to changing patterns of behavior in a constructive way that demonstrably, contributes to the organization. And you also have to kind of almost create a learning machine, so that when you come out of the relationship, the benefits for the organization, are sustained over time. So I think it's a tremendously interesting time for us, actually, in this space.
No, so very true. In the past 12 months or so here in the US, there has been a pattern in the sort of bringing or finding new talent. So companies are no longer just looking for people geographically in the vicinity of their pre-COVID physical offices. So the talent can be anywhere in the country, or even more so across sovereign borders and what have you. And then people, especially here in the US, there has been in tech industry a trend. Okay, I am working for Google or Facebook on the West Coast, but physical coordinates mean nothing anymore. I'm going to move to Austin, Texas, which is a hot place these days to move to, and Texas have many attractions, so relatively low cost of living, no state income tax and those types of things. So a lot of such patterns are emerging where people are saying, I love my West Coast salary, but I'm going to move to a Colorado or an Arizona or a Florida or what have you, or a Texas. Do you see those types of trends or mobility patterns? So it's kind of a two sides of the coin. One, that companies no longer, so if we are based in Detroit or Chicago or wherever we are based, we are no longer looking at, okay, well, the new person have to be in Metro Detroit. This person, so far as she or he, they are the right fit, they can be anywhere. Similarly, even within our company, some people have said, I always wanted to move to North Carolina, and COVID brought this opportunity because, we, like other tech companies, and also have shared with our people that, look, it's going to be a flex hybrid model, and no coming back to the office this year, perhaps next calendar year as well, because some of our customers who are also high-tech companies, they are adopting those types of practices. We are following their lead. So there's all this sort of phenomenon happening. Even in our company, the last 15 people that we have hired, they are all over the map. They logically belong to a team or a group. So a two-pronged question. First, do you see this pattern in Europe, in UK and Ireland, in that part of the world? And then to your point, you made a very interesting point that there are a lot of people, in companies who either have left or have joined, but nobody have physically met anybody. So then people are thinking about, okay, once a quarter, let's bring everybody together for a week, strategy sessions, meetups, whatever. Would love to hear what are your thoughts on that as well, that what would be good ways to bring larger groups together, maybe at some frequency, and maybe smaller groups together more frequently. So let's, maybe if it's okay, let's go there for a few minutes. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because what I think you're seeing at an employee level in a lot of instances, you're seeing a kind of it's almost like tactical response. It's like, so in London, for example, there's a great network of public transport, but it's very busy, and I have to say, it hasn't been lost on me. I think I spent maybe 15 years in London, and I used to always think to myself, it's so crazy because you get on the tube, and between 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock, it's just totally packed, and then it's pretty empty, up until 3:30 or something. And then if you think about investment and the use of assets and infrastructure, you wonder to yourself, does that make an awful lot of sense? You wonder. I often, when I'm trying to make sense of something, I often project myself into the future and think about 2 generations from now, if they look back and reflect on some of the things that we did, will they just think that we're crazy? And I think there is a craziness to that, and I do think businesses need to be better about that. I mean, I do think also that the focus, I think, in a lot of ways, is in terms of what you're delivering. Okay, but when I talk about delivering, I don't mean just about in a functional sense. I don't mean that I'm producing these 2 things that you need, because delivery is also about my presence. It's also about how I show up for the organization, how I represent, how I sponsor, how I mentor, how I engage. And I think that sometimes people get confused because they've got too narrow a definition in terms of delivery. And I say that only because I am very supportive of the flexibility, but I think it should be on an informed and transparent. And I think it's naive just to define a functional delivery as opposed to organizational participation, which I think is a lot different levels. But going back to your point about people moving, yes, I mean, I see probably this week, probably 30% of the people I'm speaking to have moved in the last 14 months or so. And inevitably across Europe, they've moved to lower price locations, better climate, and depending on their time of life, if they're like myself and their children are grown, then they have more flexibility around where they want to be. The only thing I would say about that, and the reason I say it's tactical, is because over time, organizations are going to look and they're going to say, well, hang on a second,
Yeah.
you know what, if I'm paying you £100,000 to live in London,
Yeah.
and you are living and in in Madrid, and it's worth 200,000, right? There has to be the market has to somehow get those two things in the right space so that it's a win-win for both. It can't just be a win for the employee, because, to be frank, there's no incentive then for the employer not just to go look directly, right?
That's right.
So I do think there is some transitional, as you look at the people who are in particular roles, right? And look, no one's ever going to put their hand up and say, look, you need to pay me less, right?
Yeah.
But over time, the market figures these things out, and I think it's great, because on £50,000 in Madrid, you can have a wonderful life. Probably even still better than you'll have in London on 100,000. But the benefits over time need to be shared.
Yeah.
And that's another part of an open conversation that I think needs to be had in the space. The concept of bringing groups together, I think, is really interesting. I think it's so interesting in the sense that I think that, and this is a very personal view, but historically, when we've worked with teams, they've tended to be almost functional. So it'll be the operations team or the finance team, or they'll or something along those lines. And one or two of the companies that we're talking to now are taking a slightly different view. They're kind of saying, well, you know what, I'm going to do 6 of these anyway. I'm going to do 6 of these team meetings. Maybe there's a different structure whereby perhaps during the day, the functional teams are together and dealing with the things that they need to deal with. But during the rest times, any activities that they may have, they're bringing the broader organization together so that people are building their network, and they're also building their personal equity, but also within the organization. Because one thing that I do think is very true is that people have a loyalty to other people.
Yeah.
And and loyalty, I think, is important. And I think to develop that, it makes a lot of sense to bring broader teams together without affecting the overall economics. So that is something that we are seeing. We're seeing where people are saying, look, if we're going to get together 3 times a year, maybe we'd be smarter about it and go a little deeper, maybe a little broader, right? Maybe the event isn't 3 days, maybe it's 2 days.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a focused element and there's more of an organizational element. The other thing that we're seeing as well is that as the agendas are being put together for these types of activity, there is more and more space for feedback. There is more and more asking, what can we do better? How can we do things better? And that's not always about spending money. It's actually very rarely about spending money. It's often about something that leaves the organization and has a small cost to the organization, but when it reaches the employee, it has a disproportionate benefit. And those are things that we look for and we coach people around trying to find in terms of adding value to the employee and to the organization at the minimum cost. So lots happening in that space. I think time will probably tell or answer quite a few of these questions, Amjad.
No, that's very true. And I think your observations on this tactical response, as you call it, and these mobility waves, in order for them to be sustainable over a longer period of time, there has to be a win-win. Otherwise, to your point, an employer eventually will say, okay, I will just recruit directly in Madrid or Eastern Europe or whatever the example du jour happen to be. No, very true. One other pattern that we see in supply chains is on the supply side or the supplier side of things. A lot of people that we work with and industries that we work with, they need some kind of electronic chips to go into their products. And while everybody, from a focus perspective and Pareto curves and whatnot, had a really good handle on, have the need for these specialized components. Let's not even call them chips, let's just call them components. And a lot of organizational attention on, what if this supplier does not exist and that supplier does not exist, and how do we, handle, and what if this and what if that. But then there are a lot of common components, and everybody assumed, and because pre-COVID word, common components were all abundantly available, and nobody wanted to put their finite organizational resources as to how those supply chains work and whatnot. So today, when you look into the pattern that why there is a component shortage in general, the specialized components are fine because of all that extra consciousness attention going. It is these common components that everybody assumed that the universe will just take care of common components. And so I know you have been very involved in the past about thinking about extended organizations, suppliers, relationships outside of an organization. So what would be your advice to companies to rethink about their procurement strategies, their supplier management strategies and whatnot? One quick trend that we see in some industries emerging is companies saying, look, common components, they are not strategic to your business or my business. We both need it. It is not efficient if we have people and you have people, just talking in generally in a given industry. Why don't we pool up and form some coalitions or alliances or what have you for the procurement of common stuff? Because we all need the availability of the common components, but it is not a source of differentiation or whatnot. But that is just one trend that, okay, well, we cannot individually pay attention to it, but maybe we need to pay collective attention. I know this is a subject very near and dear to your heart, just in general, of how to build such relationships, whether within an industry, competitors building relationships in areas that are not very competitive, or how do you just, in this global world, where even today, Aodan, most companies are telling us that they know their suppliers, or at least many of them, but the second degree, the visibility has a very sharp decline. They don't know what the second degree is and that sort of thing. So it's a challenge. I would love to hear your thoughts and any sort of advice, frameworks that, sir, you want to share.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I think maybe just context, I think for the viewer might be helpful in just in terms of my own journey. So, and then I'll pull out a couple of illustrations that I think might be helpful. But I started my career in media. When I started, there was still Betamax, and VHS was in growth, and that was my career opportunity. And right across that business, I started in the supply chain side, started in the factory side, and I saw a business go through exponential growth. And we would stay in the factory late at night, figuring out which customer we would have to disappoint the next day. And often it was, who do we let down the day before, and where are we on the contract, or all of these kind of very, very variables. And then you get yourself into kind of exponential growth. And we definitely saw that around the VHS world, but I think where we really saw, of course, was on DVD. And I think still it's the most successful consumer product launch ever.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the reason I think it was successful, because it wasn't recordable, you couldn't time shift really, but I think it was the consumer was ready, and the product was really good. It did have some new nuances, chaptering, added value, etc. So we brought something that was exponential, and in my role at that point in time, I used to have to put forecasts together for not just for Sony, but for the industry, because we had to build factories, and factories took 2 years, and our horizon was 2 months. You know what I mean? So we had to change our approach. We had to change our intelligence. We had to look for opportunities around flexibility. And we also had to be less concerned about our thin part of the business and be more industry players. And I think over that period of time, relationships were built that really sustained ourselves over time, because everybody realized that it's better to have 10% of a business that's worth 3.5 billion than 20% of something that's worth 500 million. So
Yeah.
So I think self-interest can definitely come in, can drive and create opportunity. But I think the next part of the journey which I think is still fascinating to me, is the whole digital physical side and that transformation and how that changed. And because digital came in, it was very slow to go to originally. It was having 300% growth rates, but off a very low base. The margin was good, but there was an awful lot of investment that was going in. And even organizationally, you had a digital group and you had a physical group. And over time, of course, the balance has switched. And I think that it's, again, you have to do the right thing for your business. So some businesses are more vested perhaps in physical, some are more in digital, right? The challenge, of course, is that where you all come together, you run the risk of moving at the slowest common speed, whoever is most reluctant. So it is about finding that balance, I think.
Yeah.
And then organizationally, I would say to you, a massive challenge is about where you've got a new, attractive, clearly going to own the future technology, and you've got another business that pays all the bills, right, and will do for the foreseeable future, but it's probably not going to put your kids through college. It doesn't necessarily have that around. And bringing those businesses together in an organization and sustaining and making it feel like one great team that's delivering on every part can ultimately be a real challenge. And then I think that what happens, I think, ultimately is the market gets to a point where you do have to say to yourself, I think you use the phrase, and it's the phrase I always use, what's your competitive advantage? How do you define yourself, right? And I would say you define yourself through your IP, through your proprietary technology, through the depth and breadth of the relationships that you have. And I think when you bring that, you realize, well, some things I just don't need to own, right? Some things I need to rent, some things I need to lease, some things I should give to somebody else. And make sure I've got the technology and the visibility to make sure that I'm seeing exactly what's happening, and I'm totally on top of that business. And I think the trick of it is, and that's why the media space is a wonderful space, because it's great product, a lot of bright people, and they're in a hurry, and that always creates challenge for partners like yourself, but also on the technology side. There are always those challenges that are coming, and I I, you know, I probably was involved in conversation. Well, I was involved with every studio in, at some point in times about how to do things together. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work. It was always easier to partner outside the US,
Yeah.
where the scale of the market almost defined it, and um, and also I think it's less visible, so it's less sensitive. I think from a shareholder perspective, and it's also about saying, hey, listen, you know what? If we could put ourselves in a place where we've got 50% market share rather than three of us having a small market share, there are economies of scale. We can engage with retail. We can keep retailing in the category, maybe in a way that we couldn't do if we were competing with each other. The idea of getting to one box, the idea of having one merchandiser going in, the idea of having shared point of sale, the idea of having clean data in which you've got consistency and visibility and measurability, I think are all things that a mature business can bring in, and just make sure that it manages the change in that life cycle, maximizes the returns to the investors, and at the same time growing that part of your business, whether it's VOD, AVOD, or whatever it is, to create to allocate the resource where internally where you can absolutely maximize your return over time. And that's the wonder of it. The wonder of great management is balancing 600 things at any point in time. It's and somehow at the end of the day, you're juggling all these things, and somehow you've managed to move forward. That's the one day at a time, one success in a day. I think that's the secret.
No, that's so very true and very well said. I was in another day in a conversation with apparel industry executives where they were just talking about some of their supply chain pains, and a topic came up. There was a brainstorming going on the need for simulations and what if this and what if that, and okay, COVID happened, probably another COVID would happen, and the frequency of black swan events is on the rise. And then somebody brought up this question on, okay, that's all fine and dandy, but we are all facing this one problem right now. And they said, well, in the past 12 months or so in the US, I think EU is the same way, due to maybe some human right issues in China or whatever. Some trade bans were put on not using cotton from China. So now all of a sudden they said, well, 1/3 of the cotton that we were counting on is no longer available. What do? We can't just overnight go to Bangladesh or some other part of the world. But then that discussion morphed into how much China is important and how much we don't know about China, and just making assumptions and that sort of thing. And I know that in the past, you and I have briefly talked about China. So I'm just interested in your perspective on, in the context of supply chains, and certainly everything is politics. So maybe in the context of geopolitics as well, what is your advice for companies who have to know more about China and how to do business in China and build, deeper relationships, not first order relationships that can disappear very, very quickly? And then just in general, how you see the role of China in 21st century. I know I asked like gazillion questions, a loaded question, but I would love to hear your perspective. I was just, it was amazing that those very senior executives were, struggling with uh, how to make models and work with uh, Chinese ecosystem and what have you, and how little people still know uh, about China. And then somebody made a point that it's all good when things are working. People think they will continue to work, but then some discontinuity happens and a lot of things stop working, and nobody knows how to turn them back on, or how to figure that out. So would love to hear just your both tactical and strategic, short-term, long-term horizon sort of thinking on China.
Yeah, I mean, I've done in various roles. I've had a reasonable amount of interaction in China. Both from a just production of various elements to movie production, actually, and distribution, and the challenges that are around that, both in a physical world and in a digital world. I mean, what I tend to say to people, the first thing I say to people about China is, the great thing about China is it's a tremendous market. It's got a massive middle class. It's consumption is has grown exponentially. So that's the first thing I say is a positive. The second thing I say is the challenge is that they know it, and in any negotiation, it tends to take time, and there's an imputed value that they have, as would make sense, around the opportunity that you have when you're in that marketplace. I think also, probably like a lot of the Asian markets that I've engaged around, you have to build a relationship, and a relationship is built over time. And a relationship is also built, it's not tactical. It has to have a long-term horizon, but it also has to have a generosity around it. So I remember, it's not the same thing, but I remember doing business in South Africa, and you get a phone call and the rand would have dropped, and there'd be an agreement in place with dollar minimums in place. And if you apply the dollar, you're going to put somebody else out of business. And very quickly, we would say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to, this is a partnership. We'll readdress that. Okay. And the trick to that is that that's how you build a relationship over time. That's how you get your business front of mind, and how you get it prioritized. I think the other thing that's really, and that sounds, like it takes a little bit of time, but the reality of it is that in China, businesses, have very long business plans. I mean, I've worked in Europe, I've worked, ad hoc in Asia, a lot of time in the US. In the US, I found that, the mix between salary and bonus and was quite high proportionally, and a lot of it was driven by the end of year results, which can drive a behavior which is more about the results at that point in time, rather than creating value and equity in a business over decades. And
Yeah.
in the China world, it is about decades. It is about that longer term view. And I would say there's not an arrogance around when you do business in China, but there's an ingrained view that they're not surprised at how well they are doing as a country, because historically that's pretty much where they came from. You know what I mean? So in some ways, there's almost a bit of a resetting that happens, and I think you have to understand that and appreciate that, so that things don't come at you in the long run. So having said that, what's the world, in the future, what's the place of China? And I think that, the reality of it is that China is engaged in business in all parts of the world. I mean, I was in Australia before Christmas, and you know, there was so much Chinese business and money and, you know, owning mines and owning harbors and estate agents that were offsets to Chinese companies and stuff. You know, I come into, you know, I'm in Ireland, you know what I mean? And one of the big engagements in Ireland at this point in time is with the Chinese government around the free movement of beef and the like. And you know, and in Latin America, where I used to travel quite a lot, there's also a massive Chinese influence. So again, I think it's one of those
Yeah.
things where I think we talked a little bit earlier about the reset button. You know what I mean? You have to start from where you are, and the reality of it is that the Chinese business opportunity is massive, and it's everywhere. And I think the trick is you have to engage with it positively, respectfully, take your time, because you do have to build trust and also friendship. And you know, if you do somebody a favor, that doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean there's an instant response to it. It is different, and it builds through that way. And I think that, you know, the technology, the advances that they're making, the investments that they're making, you know, in the old days, you know, they used to take product from the West and reproduce it. Now they, you know, it's just a very, very different world. So it's not going away. And I think that any business with global aspirations in the next few decades has got to engage. And
Yeah.
I think a big part of that engagement is partnering and getting the right partner, whether it's financial institutions or people on the ground, because of the kind of local majority ownership requirements and the like.
Yeah.
So massive opportunity. But as you engage, remember that they know that it is, and it's a tough deal to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we can talk a little bit about, in the context of supply chains now, and disruptions, Brexit and the challenges of Brexit. And one sort of context into that is that in many cases, supply chain costs or financial transaction costs just to enable trade is a big part of a GDP, and sometimes it is considered not a very productive part of GDP. So there is all this discussion on free flow of goods and information, and how to bring that cost down, because apparently, you know, it has direct impact on people's quality of living, their ability to buy stuff, and you know, standards of living and all those things. So in that context, how do you see the Brexit and its impact on supply chain and flow of goods and regulations and just, you know, commerce and disruptions to commerce? I know that the system is still sort of understanding and absorbing what it actually means, because it's not fully understood yet. But would love to, you know, if you can give us your thoughts or any predictions, would love to hear that from you.
Yeah. Well, look, I think what's well said there, Amjad, is it's still working its way through. I think that if we go back, and I think it's 5 years ago since the UK made that decision, I think that everybody was shocked and surprised. I remember the evening myself, and I remember looking at the polls, and it seemed incredibly clear that they would be staying within Europe. And then I got up the next morning, and the pound had fallen 20%, and you know, it had gone the other way. And I think that everybody was shocked and surprised. And then there was a process which involved 3 government changes to try and figure out a way to make it work. And you know, it's interesting. I mean, I even just on the weekend I was reading something on it, but the UK represents 6% of the European GDP, right, in terms of exports, right? Whereas the UK's exports into Europe represent 47%. That's the scale of it and the reality of it. And I think, personally, I think it's unfortunate because I do believe the free trade creates value and wealth over time. And what's happening now is that the changes are happening. So the UK is doing free trade agreements with other entities. So it's just signed one with Australia. And there's a lot of press around this, that Australian wines will now be cheaper in the UK because they haven't got this excess. But the calculation of the positive contribution to GDP of that deal is 0.006%. So the headlines are much greater than the reality. And there are some real challenges from a supply chain perspective. I mean, I'm in Southern Ireland now, which is part of Europe. 30 miles up the road, there's a border that you cannot see. There are no stops, there are nothing. But beyond that, you're in the UK, and the UK has left the European Union. And there are regulations that have been put around the management of that part of the territory, Northern Ireland as it is, which are quite complicated and which are frustrating the free movement of goods into retail. But I think we run the risk of almost an all-out trade war if it doesn't get sorted. And so at this point in time, there's a 3-month extension on the regulations around chilled meats, for example. So the UK press has been full of stories about a European sausage war, right? Because things have to be checked because coming into Northern Ireland, they have to be checked because there is no border between the two territories. So there are a lot of those things that are going on that I think are quite difficult for people. There's also, I've seen smaller businesses in the UK. I was watching something about a cheese company that sends Stilton, which is a British cheese, to France, and now the costs of having things cleared through for importation is not affordable in the margin of their business. So there is a kind of a resettling that's happening. I think it's really unfortunate. I think there's a lot of inefficiencies that are going to come from it, and that if I could go back in time, I would have told all my friends, don't do this. It doesn't make an awful lot of sense. And there's other soft issues as well, Amjad. I mean, the biggest group for tourism in Europe that travels is the UK. So they travel to Portugal, to Spain, to everywhere. And a lot of them have got second homes and stuff. And now they can only go for, I think it's 90 days, and then they have to register, and there's a whole process that they have to go through. It affects their inheritance rights locally and things like that. So I think there's a whole mish of stuff that is unfortunate and is driving inefficiencies, which ultimately don't create value. And when there's no value created, there's nothing to be shared by the producer and the consumer over time. It will get fixed and it will work, right? Ultimately, over time, a lot of those things will be pragmatic. They'll be systems based. There'll be pre-notifications that'll have to happen. But I think a decade of efficiencies will be lost. But it is what it is, and we have to accept their decision and move on. So.
Yeah, no, as you said, it is unfortunate, and from a supply chain perspective, and I think from many different perspectives, free flow of trade, as you said, over a longer period of time, it creates win-win for all parties involved. I want to move our conversation towards entrepreneurship in Ireland. And the context, let me give you, Aodan, a little bit of a context. So even though large US corporations have been, setting up their bases in Ireland and leveraging the low corporate tax rates and other benefits,
Mhm.
the startups in the US for the first time, are asking this question: how do we get to know more about Ireland? How do we engage with Ireland? So maybe, if you can, maybe we'll do in future, a whole session on that. But if you can maybe talk about, if a technology startup is thinking about setting up operations in Ireland, or just, want to have a framework of how to think about that. What would be first, if you maybe want to share with everybody the startup scene in Ireland itself, because there are a lot of intrinsic startup and innovation activity going on within Ireland itself. And then suddenly there are all kind of partnerships, whether from other parts of Europe in Ireland, or US or Canada with Ireland. But so maybe just a few minutes on how that ecosystem is building and evolving. And then if a new startup, they have aspiration to do something or partner with Ireland, because there is just such wonderful talent and tech friendly, entrepreneur friendly laws. What would be your advice, Aodan, for tech startups?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, first of all, I think just to put your question in context, I think probably in the last 20 years or so, 25 years or so, probably about 70% of the investment, software investment in Europe has come into Ireland. Right now, there's a crazy revolution going on about service centers for people, for servers, for every major company that you can think about: Facebook, Google, well, just every major company, software company. I mean, we do a lot of stuff with Microsoft, who are here and have their own ecosystem and their own campus. And I think, it's interesting. A little bit of it is around the social structure, in the sense that historically in Ireland, there's always been what's called a social partnership, which is almost a 3-year contract between the government and the people. It's the investment that will be made in but also foreign direct investment is something that the government is very focused on, in providing infrastructure and providing support. So, for example, a lot of the companies that are coming in, they're saying, okay, well, we have to have non-carbon energy. So you've got to build wind farms for us, and the like, and all of that's happening both onshore and offshore. But it took a long time. It took 25 years of development. The government and the education departments, they partnered with the big companies. The education structures, degrees, the master programs, all of those were developed to create the right flow and the right understanding to fill these businesses and support these businesses over time. So, the headline rate of corporation tax in that area is 12%. And
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful story where 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the European Union, they rang up Ireland and they said, listen, Ireland, we can't tell you what tax to charge, but you're only charging these companies 12%. I think all the other companies were on 30% or something.
Yeah.
And then the response came the next day and they said, no, you're absolutely right. We're going to make it 12% for everybody.
Yeah.
It is a low corporate tax environment. The other side of that, though, it is a high income tax environment.
Yeah.
So the government doesn't take it from the companies, but it does take it. The marginal rates of tax here, they can get over 55% on a relatively modest, salary package. But having said that, always in the quality of life statistics that you see, it's always in the top 10. It's very attractive to US companies. There's no language issues. It's very friendly. It's very benevolent. I mean, sometimes they say it's like a US state, and people feel very comfortable. And then once it reaches a certain size, it almost has its own ecosystem. So you've got the big players who are having bigger and bigger campuses in place. But then there's also the network of suppliers, whether it's the printers for, a good friend of mine does a lot of the printing for Microsoft, and that's a 30-year relationship. And off the back of that other relationship, other, opportunities absolutely come. So I would say what there is there's a positive structure and environment around investments. It's very steady economically, it's very steady politically, and it is now the only English language territory that's within the EU. So actually,
Yeah, yeah,
we're seeing a lot of UK companies. I read recently Cambridge University is moving one of its companies across, a company that does medical testing, because of the benefits of being within the EU. And yes, I mean, software is massive. We also do a lot of coaching, by the way, in the pharma industry. So people like Abbott and Novartis are here, and all of them have their European, headquarters as such. So that's the ecosystem that we find. I think the structures, there are clear government structures that if you want to come in, there's something called the Industrial Development Authority. They work with you in terms of infrastructure, location. Frankly, there's a lot of grants that are available to come in. A lot of training is paid for, and there's they look for commitment. And what I would say also is, now it's probably more attractive outside the big cities. There's a place called Dundalk, which is kind of halfway between Dublin and Belfast. I was there in the last couple of days. There's some massive Chinese companies that are coming in. They're calling it New Hong Kong because of, but all of these things, I think all of that kind of positive energy is something that you can pick up on. And I've done a lot of work actually with startups and with entrepreneurs, and there are a lot of programs that are out there where people will, the government will take equity in your company, put investment in, help you build business plans. It will put mentors in place for you. There are government offices in every major city on the planet, and they'll get talent to come in, and support you and assist you. And I think that's because we've done it for a long time and done to a high standard. I actually worked for the idea years and years ago, but I think that's what happens. I think it's like when somebody is interested or has an idea, it's not the first time that's come up. It's not the first time that we've been on that journey, and therefore, there's a very seamless, route towards investment. And I think the other thing I would just finally say on this, actually, what I'm noticing is because I have an association with Trinity and with UCD, which are probably the two bigger universities, but I see this across a lot of the other universities as well, is a lot of startup companies on their own campuses where the universities are taking shares in, where the government is providing shares in, or investing in, and the partnership between education and commerce, particularly around startups, is growing fairly exponentially. I think 15 years ago it may have been, well, one is one is the other. There isn't a gap now. I think it's it's like good insight in education is important, but it's even better when it's validated in the marketplace. And I think that's something that is changing. So yeah, no, I think it's a very positive situation. I mean, even with COVID, I think the GDP grew by about 6.7%.
yeah.
and for 15 years it had the fastest, GDP
Yeah.
growth in Europe, and it's sustained at this point. So.
No, very, very positive story. On a practical note, Aiden, if a company in US or Canada or any other part of the world, a startup wants to know about Ireland, wants to set up an operation in Ireland, does Aiden, your consulting firm, offer those types of services? And if so, where can people find you and your sort of your company or your website? And then, and if not, then what other sources are available? This is a question that few people ask me, so I was going to ask you this.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I would say it's something that we do. It's something we've done, quite a few times, because we are partnered with some of those education groups. And I would say if we can't help, we can find somebody who can help. It's not that big a place, and we know quite a few people. It's pretty easy to get me. It's Aodan, which is AODAN, and at globalcoachingdelivered.com. And we have a website, which is globalcoachingdelivered.com as well.
We will put links of those in the video as well for everybody's benefit. Yeah. That question comes up quite a bit, that okay, well, we want to explore it. Is there a trusted partner that we can talk to? And to your point, Aiden, that you guys have done it many times before, and if you don't know an answer to a question, how to go get an answer to that question. But it looks like you guys are very well set up to help a startup that wants to set up an operation in Ireland and want to do it the right way and leverage all the benefits and programs that are available.
Yeah, and there's a lot. So.
And there is quite a bit. No, that is awesome. As we are bringing our conversation, Aiden, to a closure, maybe just a full 360-degree from where we started the discussion. So certainly with COVID, it is on everybody's mind that volatility is on the rise, and these types of uncertainties and black swan events, they will continue to happen. Some of them are somewhat predictable, others are not. So just as we wrap our conversation today, what is your advice for senior executives as to what type of questions they should be asking to prepare? And sometimes starting questions at least starts a journey, even if the answers are not readily available, but it gets a conversation going. So I think that would be an awesome way for us to end bring our conversation to closure as to your, overall advice on, in this global context, what are some important questions that we should be continuously asking ourselves?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to live through a few catastrophic events during my 30 years at Sony, and the one thing I think that always came back to me in those periods were, and it's not about systems, actually. Genuinely, it's about people.
Yeah.
And when you are faced with something that maybe no one's ever seen before. I mean, I referenced the Sony hack. Every system went down. I think 90% of our business in North America was run by VMI. Our major retail partners would not accept our emails. They would not engage with us. We had no way to plan. We had no systems. You couldn't log in. And the thing that happens then is that every human resource decision that you've made in the previous 5 years comes back at you. Comes back at you in a positive way or in a negative way. The people that step up, the people that step out, the people who are visible, the people who are invisible. And I would say that if you have the right people in place, you can trade and you can succeed through those traumatic events. I would say more than that. I would say that often organizations who have those challenges and where people rise and what happens is you become just focused on getting it done. It becomes less about the hierarchy, less about the reporting. It becomes about trusting somebody to get it done. There's less supervision, and people respond and they engage. And I've often heard it said, that internally, when, say, for example, when we went through that period, there was such a sense of camaraderie that a year and a half when we'd come out of it, it was something we missed and we longed for. We missed the challenge and the intimacy and the consistency and the teamwork that we had. And I would say, that all starts with managing the most important resource, which is your people, and be thoughtful and think about not just this role, but be strategic about how they could develop. And maybe even now ask yourself that in those black swan moments, who are the people that you would reach out to and want to be closest, to you and to support your business in those times. And I think if you take that approach, you won't go far wrong.
Very well said. And I think it's a great spot for us to end our conversation today. Aodan, this has been super fun. I'm sure people who will be watching it, they will thoroughly enjoy it. We covered a very wide range of topics. Thank you for being so gracious with your time.
No, thank you for the invitation, Amjad. I appreciate it.